Jesus obviously thinks fairly highly of us. He says that we are the salt of the earth. Now, that may or may not sound like very high praise because salt isn't very glamorous, at least not these days. Salt doesn't cost very much. It's readily available. So sometimes we fail to appreciate its more stellar qualities. But think about salt for a moment. Salt, most obviously, flavors our food so that it becomes palatable. Little salt makes the difference between food that you love and food that you would rather not have in your mouth. If you've been prescribed at any point in your life a no-salt diet, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I challenge you, if you don't understand this, to go on a no-salt diet for about a week and see how much you enjoy your favorite foods. You are the salt of the earth. We're continuing on a series in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through chapter 5, 6, and 7. And last week we addressed the Beatitudes, which is the opening section of the Sermon on the Mount. And we read there about the one that God seeks to bless. We acknowledge that we all really want to be blessed, but we're just not sure that we want to be in that list of folks who are blessed. The poor in spirit, the mourning, the grieving, the persecuted. Not sure these are the kind of values that our society really lifts up. And last week, using the analogy of the Super Bowl, I said the Sermon on the Mount points out that we live in a world that trains us to look in the wrong places for definitions of success, happiness, and evidence of the good life. Then I leaned into this week by reminding us that we are a new society, that we are an outpost of God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, as Matthew calls it, in our world today. And that means that Jesus thinks pretty highly of us. And the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, it begins to tell us how we are going to make that look and how Jesus is with us to this day. He says of us first in our gospel today that you are the salt of the earth. You're important. You bring godly flavor into the world in which you live. You bring the flavor of love. You bring the flavor of joy. You bring the flavor of service into the world. You are the salt of the world. Of course, adding salt is more than adding flavor. Salt is a preservative, which oftentimes we have forgotten. In periods past, before refrigeration, salt was the primary preservative that kept meat from spoiling. Jesus says, you are the salt of the world. You're a preservative for something. We, the church, are a preservative for our world, to remind the world that the values that sometimes are lifted up are the ones that will lead us toward destruction. Misordered affection always leads to destruction. That's Augustine, by the way. We aren't Christ, of course. We aren't saving the world, but we're reflecting that kind of love into the world so that the world might know that there is an alternative way in which to be, a new society, that Christ may continue to transform and to save lives in the world today. You are the salt of the earth. Salt. We are God's salt. God has made us partners in the grand enterprise of saving the world. Salt isn't always pleasant. If you've ever had a cut on your hand and you are at dinner or eating French fries or something that's a particularly salty food, though I know most of you do not do that, we know that salt in the wound is exceedingly painful. It hurts. Donald Bloch tells us that the church's role as salt in the earth is sometimes that kind of pain. He says, we're called to be not the honey of the world, but the salt of the earth. Salt stings in an open wound, he says, but salt also saves it from gangrene. Our role in the world may not always be popular. We are like salt sometimes in the wound. It's been that way from the beginning. Look at the prophets, the word that they spoke, how unpopular it was, which resulted in open persecution, sometimes the death of those who had followed the light of the world into the world. The prophets were called to speak God's truth in the world, and it wasn't always a very popular word. It was like salt in a wound. Salt's not always welcome. In our culture today, if you admit to being a religious person, you're not always welcome. If you admit to being a Christian, oftentimes you're pigeonholed as a particular type of hatred-filled person. Salt isn't always welcome. Disciples are not always welcome. A.W. Tozer in the Civil War put it this way. He says, to be right with God often meant to be in trouble with men. I left it his translation, but that means people, of course. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. That doesn't always mean that we're going to be popular or welcome. Sometimes it means that we're going to be unpopular. You're the salt of the earth, he said, but the salt has lost its flavor. With what will it be salted? It is then good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden underfoot. The church sometimes loses its saltiness, doesn't it? We're tempted to tell people what they want to hear because that brings money into the treasury of the church, and that brings people into the pews of the church. We like to be popular. We don't want to offend people, but it's easy to lose our nerve when we know what the truth is. It's kind of a fine line, though, isn't it? If you've ever spoken a word of truth, you often know that sometimes it's highly unpopular, that sometimes it's like salt in a wound. People respond in anger at times when truth is spoken. But we have to ask the question of the fine line. Am I being a prophet, one who speaks for God, or am I just being a pain in the neck? Which is it? Am I speaking the truth, or am I just being insensitive? Am I speaking the truth in love, as the New Testament tells us? How do we bring this truth in a way that can be received and lives transformed, that it can be a flavoring to a life rather than salt in a wound? In Jesus' day, much of the salt that was used came from the Dead Sea, one of the most saline bodies of water on the planet. Salt cannot change its chemical compound, but it can be adulterated. It can be compromised. It can be diluted. Other chemicals can do that. Other things can do that. In Jesus' day, if that kind of salt was so compromised by other things present in it, it wasn't good for salting anything. We can be adulterated, compromised, and diluted as well. Our distinctiveness to make our world the kind of place where God's blessing easily flows is what we're to be about. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. The interesting thing about Matthew's gospel is that it's trying to demonstrate how God's blessing flows into the world. And what we're seeing in the Sermon on the Mount is that the world doesn't always appreciate where the blessings of God want to flow. To the meek. I mean, when was the last time you saw the meek really get ahead? I mean, they're never going to have one of those reality shows, are they? You know, the real lives of the meek. It's just not going to happen, is it? The meek won't inherit the earth until God's judgment comes to the world. That's Matthew's conclusion. The judgment must come to the world in order to straighten out the values of the world. That's why our gospel kind of ends the way it does today, talking about the kingdom of heaven, which is not a future place, but a present one. Kingdom of heaven is the term used in Matthew's gospel. Kingdom of God is what's used in the other synoptic gospels to describe the reality of God's reign and rule in life today, and ultimately how it will be fulfilled in the world to come. But the kingdom of heaven is not just simply the place in the future where we go after we die. The kingdom of heaven is what happens when a life begins to live the values and the blessing of God begins to flow through that life. And that's what it means to be salt and light, conduits of God's blessing into the world. If we're adulterated, if we're diluted, if we're compromised, we lose our purpose and we lose our distinctiveness in the world, which is why I'm very hopeful about the standing of the church in our culture. When I was a child, I was remembering that this morning. I was saying to my wife, when I was a child, the grocery stores weren't open on Sunday morning. I lived in this was backwater, small town, Ohio. Nothing was open. But the church was comfortable in society. Now, we're not as comfortable in society, are we? We wonder, what happened? But we can begin to taste the saltiness and the distinctiveness of what we bring to the table to the world. It may not be comfortable to be salt, not for the salt itself or for those who receive us, but we can find our distinctive voice again. You are the salt of the earth. Jesus also says that we are the light of the world. Wow, that's quite a tribute. In another place, in John's Gospels, Jesus would say, I am, meaning he was the light, or is the light of the world. If Jesus is the light of the world and we are the light of the world, are we one and the same with Jesus? No, I think the best analogy is to talk about the sun and the moon. The sun, of course, is that which generates the light. What does the moon do? Does the moon generate anything? Gravitational pull. No, it's a reflector. And when we get the full face of the moon, we get what we call moonbeams. The moon lights up the earth, and it's a great big full moon. It's a beautiful, you can almost walk outside and not stumble over things because the light is so brilliant. But is it a moonbeam? No, it is not. It's the reflection of a sunbeam. We just happen to call it a moonbeam. And when we are in right relationship with God, when we are rightly facing toward God, we reflect that light in the same way and beautify, enrich all that are around us. We become a conduit for those kind of blessings that God longs to bring in the world. Jesus said this, you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do we light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket. That would just be ridiculous. But we put it on a stand so that all might see in the house. Even so, as our baptismal promise says, we'll hear it today as one of the two people in the Billingsley families are baptized this morning. We say, let your light so shine before others that they will see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Note the purpose. Jesus doesn't call us to shine our light to make people happy. Jesus doesn't call us to shine our light to do a self-improvement project. That's kind of what's going on in the second reading. Paul's talking about the self-improvement project of the spiritual but not religious types of folks. That was Corinth. And we saw the disaster of the spiritual but not religious type of life, which is untethered and self-serving. The outcome of Christian faith, the outcome of the religious and spiritual life, is not self-development. The outcome of the spiritual life is service of the neighbor in the world, to bless the meek, to bless the mourning, to feed the hungry, to provide for the thirsty, to stand with those who are persecuted for values and righteousness' sake in and among the world. The outcome of our faith is not self-improvement. The outcome of our faith is to be of good service to God and to give glory to Him, to reflect that light, that others might see that light and give glory to their Father who is in heaven. So our personal conduct, especially for Matthew's gospel, becomes exceedingly important because it is a reflection upon that light that shines upon us. If I claim to belong to Christ, but my behavior belongs to, well, at best, myself, how can that draw anyone to Christ? And so Jesus says, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Now note the language. They don't get kicked out. They're least in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever teaches them and does these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, and this is a line you probably focused on because it was the last one, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You probably threw your hands up and said, that's it. Who can be saved? We're tempted to discount the end of this because it sounds so much like judgment. But if you look at our world and the values that are lifted up and you compare them to what you hear each week as we read these lessons, you have to understand that there is a misstep. There is something not in line with the values that we hear of in Scripture and in the church and the values that we see promoted to us through our culture. Sometimes the best way to keep a child from touching a hot stove is to raise your voice and to alarm them, which sometimes even frightens them. But we are to see our good works, the manner of our life, as a reflection of God's righteousness in the world, a reflection of how God longs to bless those in the world that are often not lifted up. But they're to be lives of witness, lives that are well lived. Matthew's gospel, the phrase is, to fulfill all righteousness. What is that? Right living with God and with our neighbors. Benjamin Franklin. I'm glad you mentioned Benjamin Franklin. Franklin knew the power of a life well lived. He knew the power of example. At one point, Franklin decided that the city of Philadelphia needed lights on its streets, and the lights would guide passersby. They wouldn't stumble over the cobblestones. The light would discourage thievery. The lights would make a city a much more wonderful and beautiful place to live. There were no lights in the city of Philadelphia at the time. And now I'd like you to imagine how it would be that you would go about getting lights in the city of Goura if there were no lights, or the city of Newbury Park or Thousand Oaks, wherever it is that you live. We would hire a consultant, wouldn't we? We'd draw up charts. We'd do a financial plan. But that's not what Franklin did. Benjamin Franklin didn't hire a consultant. He didn't go to the assembly and make a political statement about the benefit of lights in the city. How did he do this? How did he get the city of Philadelphia, which is now filled with street lights, to begin to have them? He didn't fill out a petition. He didn't go door to door. Franklin set out to persuade the people of Philadelphia by a simple demonstration of the effectiveness of such light. He bought an attractive lantern. He polished the glass and placed it on a long bracket extending out from his house toward the street. And each evening, he went out and he lit the wick. And his neighbors began to notice that in front of Benjamin Franklin's house, there was beautiful light. They were drawn to it when they were walking down the street. They could have gone another street, but they saw the light and they felt drawn to it. They felt drawn to its safety. They felt drawn to the ability to walk both safely underfoot as well as avoiding any problems. They didn't have to step hesitantly. They could walk confidently. So a neighbor down the street from Benjamin Franklin bought a similar lamp, but he put it up. And then a neighbor on the next block saw those lights on that street and thought it was beautiful. And so that neighbor went and bought a similar lamp, and they put it up on their street. And over and over and over again, it was repeated. He didn't lobby the legislature. He simply bought a lamp and placed it in front of his house. And other people bought lamps and placed them in front of their house. And the light began to spread. And the city of brotherly love became the city of evening light. All because Benjamin Franklin showed them what one person could do by letting his light so shine before others. Jesus says to us that we are to let our light so shine before others that they will see our good works and give glory to our Father in heaven. Now, whenever I preach a "you should" sermon, everybody feels condemned. I wish you wouldn't do that, because you discount what the light and the salt is already doing in your life. How is the light of God being reflected in your life? How is the salt of the earth making its way, filtering through you into the lives of others? There are countless ways in this congregation that happens. There are countless ways, as I look around this room, that I could name that it happens through those of you that are seated here. Overnight, Amra Chudley Neal posted a little page from Stella, their daughter, Stella. And it must have been a project for school. She didn't say. All she posted was, "My job is done here." And it's entitled, "If I had $100. And the project says, if you had $100, what would you buy or give away or invest, and why would you do it? And she said, if I had $100, I would buy one thing for each of my family members and keep some for college and give the rest away to the poor. I would do that because they need it more than I do." Tastes a little salty. I see a little light. How is it that the salt and the light is working in your life? More often than not, it's working in unconscious ways. What the Gospel of Matthew wants us to know is that we have an important role to play in our world, to open up avenues for the way in which God longs to bless all of humanity and all of creation, and he will do it by various conduits, salt and light, both avenues through which we allow God's blessings to flow into the world. Leo Tolstoy once wrote, "The business of a Christian," and I'm going to skip a little bit, "is everywhere and always one, to increase one's fire and give light to men." Austin Lewis said this, "You are the light of the world, but the switch must be turned on." We can cooperate in this endeavor with God, of course. We can become conscious of it. More often than not, most of us go through our days doing our deeds pretty unconscious of the fact that we're God's representatives in the world and that we have a distinctive purpose and are supposed to give a distinctive flavor to life. What Austin Lewis is trying to say is, bring it to waking consciousness so that you are aware of who you are in the world and that those values and those blessings that God longs to bring to the world will open up in and through you. So when you leave church here today, when you go to work tomorrow, when you do your routine chores this week, consider how your life affects the lives of those around you. Are you spreading some light? Are you zesting things up? Before you speak to your children, your coworker, your friends, your spouse, consider whether or not you're hanging a lantern or letting them stumble in the darkness, leaving life bland and tasteless, or bringing robust, full-bodied flavor to the world. We have an important purpose, folks. We're to live on purpose as God's people. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Amen. Let's sing together, folks, if you'll join with our worship team.